Hi all, and thank you for your patience. My eye is coming back, and the other one is doing its best to keep up. I am sorry. I'd hoped to have this up sooner, and I know that I owe you all some emails and some responses, and I'll get to that as over the weekend as my eyes will allow me to do so. I just want to talk briefly about this idea of kind of cyberculture uh, and hacker ethics and that intersection and kind of the Silicon Valley feeling and what that might tell us about uh, public spaces. And I'll start by saying that if you look out around the web, you'll find conversations on Reddit and other places about what it takes to be, what it means to be a burner. The burners are what people who go to Burning Man either once, I guess, or especially those who go with some frequency, what they call themselves. And uh, so maybe that's all it really takes to be a burner, right? Maybe it's if you go to Burning Man, you're a burner, and that's enough. But most of these discussions are, there are people who go to Burning Man who are not burners. So to be a burner, most of these resolve to the opinion that to be a burner, what you have to do is know and follow the principles. So Burning Man is built on a set of principles of rules. It's supposed to be this chaotic, radically free uh, space where you could do what you wouldn't normally be able to do at home and not get in trouble for it. But for that to happen, you have to follow these rules, these principles that you kind of agree to follow by going in the front door, so to speak, of Burning Man. So you go through the gates, and when you do, you kind of agree that these are some basic rules that you're going to follow, that you're going to adhere to in spirit, not just in letter, but in spirit. And these are things like the issue of like whether everything there is for gifting and all of this whole set of rules. Yeah, some argue that most of the people who actually go to Burning Man forget those or would have to look them up if they really need to know them or whatever. But there is this maybe generative code. They adhere to this code. It's that when you think of it that way, you're quickly reminded of other spaces that are putatively chaotic, putatively anarchistic, but have a set of codes. The pirates code for one, right? That pirates are pirates, and yet they follow, and they don't follow most of the rules, but they do follow kind of a set of rules, and this isn't just made up for movies and for Gilbert and Sullivan and that sort of thing. There was some ideal of a pirate's code, a collectively agreed upon set of expectations for how pirates ought to behave, and there's a lot of actually recent scholarship on this, and a lot of them had things like permanent disability rules, like if a pirate lost an eye, how much extra share in the loot they would get. All of these kinds of pieces that were either explicitly shared codes or that were implicitly kind of part of the expectations. And so, there's that. There's Wikipedia has the three principles. So, you look at a Wikipedia and say, how could this work? It's, there's no rule. Anyone can go in and change anything. Yeah, pure anarchy. And yet it's fairly good at keeping order. There are the three principles that everyone kind of adheres to. And then there's actually a set of kind of cultural expectations as well that are not explicit, but that people adhere to, that kind of evolve over time. And there's a kind of bureaucracy as well, and there are differences in past. So there's stuff that's hiding in there. That's true for Burning Man too. But generally speaking, they're generated by the codes. These spaces that are meant for free expression and for collaboration and for co-creation exist because people come into them with a shared core understanding. And if this reminds you of anything, like the idea of public spheres requiring a certain set of ground rules as you enter, that's by no accident. So I think there is a continuity here. I think that could be overdrawn, and I'm sure there's someone who's talked more about this that I just don't know of offhand, but there seems to be a very clear line between these these prototypical Habermasian public spheres, the coffee house, the salon, where there were expectations for behavior going in, and there were some, as we've also talked about, some unwritten rules that were not as clear, but still that still constrained those spaces. But generally speaking, without those rules, you didn't have the ability to engage in that public discussion, in that space where you could collaborate. So even though none of the things that we were reading this week was explicitly talking about this question of publics, I think that when we're talking about collaborative spaces, when we're talking about uh, peer production and that sort of thing, really we're talking about public sphere. Really, we're talking about this ability to create and maintain publics. Turner takes Burning Man from a fairly critical perspective, and I think more so in other places than this article. But even in this article, it's I think he stresses a bit that even though it's putatively this, again, the ideal of Burning Man is this space away from space. This you go out on the playa, it's a separate kind of like a Silicon Valley dream space of a kind, right? Where everybody gets to share in their ideals and play them out. It's kind of a lab. It's kind of a networking event, so it has it has multiple roles at the same time. And I think that he suggests, I don't know that he says this explicitly, at least not in this article, that there's something here that's not quite kosher about it being that kind of a space, because there's something called the temporary autonomous zone, this idea that you can have anarchy, but it can only happen temporarily. You can have autonomy, but only temporarily. And so maybe this is kind of a release valve for those who are in the sort of hyper-competitive sphere of Silicon Valley. You get out of town for a little bit, you get to, you don't wear ties in Silicon Valley. You get to let your hoodie loose a little bit, whatever, and engage in this kind of idealized space where you get to kind of bond over these common ideas, but it's only in kind of contrast with what happens in Silicon Valley. And in Silicon Valley, people like Elon Musk or the Googles and Facebooks and the Amazons of the world, these feel very much like Ayn Rand and kind of the most extreme version of the individualistic, competitive view of the world that seems very much in contrast with what we hear as the ideals of co-production and sharing and gifting that are part of Burning Man, right? So it's very easy to look at Silicon Valley and see it as being deep, as having very deep contrasts. But I think that those are not as far away as it might immediately seem. So, Silicon Valley has that on the one hand. I mean, I think you can make the argument, if you look at the top 100 richest people in the world, most of them are still have control of oil, but a large number of them, especially the ones that are new over the last 20 years, are people that are involved in technology, right? And so there's no question that, it's not this ideal space in which people share openly and nobody makes any money. It's not that at all. People are making tons of money in Silicon Valley. And so how does that mesh with a history, especially during the 60s and 70s, of this back to the land and communalism? Turner has a whole book about this. But I think that that tension can be overdrawn. A lot of the back to the land stuff and communal stuff, some of them were very traditional communes, and actually the ones that have survived the longest in Northern California and elsewhere on the West Coast especially are kind of traditional communes. But a lot of this back to the land stuff was really, I guess, more DIY. It was like, you can't do a lot of DIY in your apartment, so let's get off the grid where we can kind of do what we want to do and really understand the tools and kind of build our own space and use technology to make new social organizations. That's still a big part of what Silicon Valley is trying to do, right? They're creating these spaces by making technologies that support them. So, I think they get blamed a lot for doing for engaging in technology for the sake of technology. And I don't think that's often the case. I think they're really using technology in order to create new kinds of social relationships. And they may be doing that also to create profit. I mean, that's what Uber is, right? Like, it's not, there is technology involved in Uber, but the technology enables new kinds of industrial relationships in many ways. But I think there is that those two can go hand in hand in some ways. They're trying to down traditional forms of social interaction as well, just like they have for technology, and reinvent them in a way that is not necessarily emancipatory, but at least changes things, right? Innovation requires you to break down those existing pieces. Turner also kind of draws on Benkler's idea that this is uh, a trial space, a testing ground for um, peer collaboration, right? For peer-based, commons-based production processes. Uh, and I think that's true. And I think that remains an ideal, especially in the computing areas for reasons that are in some way specific to computing. We'll get to that in a second. That some pieces of some of the things that we produce when we produce software is different from hardware because it's a non-alienable good. You can share it without losing money, and there's other pieces here that make it strangely suited to co-production. But it is still this huge contrast, right? Silicon Valley is definitely not the playa. It's not, Silicon Valley is all about aggressively private spaces. It's very much not separate from industry. It's not a public space. It's not a public space. It's very much a private space. It's even the public spaces are private. Google is sending a bus. It's a private bus for Googlers into San Francisco and parking where the public bus is supposed to go, stopping at public bus stops, and then Googlers are having protests against poor people being in their city. So I mean, this is so not the playa. It's the exact opposite of Burning Man. The industries are patent chasing. They'll patent things they don't even plan to use so that they can stop other people from using it. It still feels, even though I think there's things that connect the two, it still feels pretty schizophrenic. There's a book by Cory Doctorow, a novel called Walk Away. And part of what he argues in there is this, what happens when that strange schizoid view of the world becomes the norm for everywhere. In other words, and he suggests that there's like this, that America and the rest of the world too, but especially America becomes, America and Canada, North America becomes this space where, a bunch of people just walk away from their jobs. They stop working. And this is part of, he has a couple of books about this, about the makers movement and how people just kind of drop their jobs, go and be creative and share the stuff they make. And part of that is that requires, as does the maker movement in general, a lot of industrial processes that aren't easily done away with. He talks about how they recycle stuff that exists already or that kind of thing. But if you look at the makers movement right now, someone has to make, if you're doing 3D printing, someone has to make the PLA, the spools of PLA. Someone has to make all those chips. Someone needs to make, someone needs to make the screws that hold things together. And that someone is China for the most part, right? So we already have that division. It just tends to be that we outsource a lot of the stuff that's more traditionally industrial processes now. They don't talk so much about this makers movement, either of these guys. I think that a lot of the hacker the ideal of hackers has moved into, in a more pure form, the makers movement. And so, if you didn't want to go to Burning Man, and why wouldn't you want to go to Burning Man? Well, for one thing, it's really expensive to go. It's not just in terms of the tickets now, which are quite expensive, but I haven't been, by the way. I'm doing this all from the outside. But not just, I know burners, I know people who go every year if they can. Those people tend to be people who are either fairly well off and are, sort of professional level where they can, if you're in Silicon Valley and you're saying, I'm going to take 2 or 3 weeks off, get an RV and drive out to the middle of the desert, and you can do that and know you'll still have a job when you get back. Either at that end, or there's also kind of the lumpen proletariat and the people who are artists and that kind of thing where they don't have regular jobs, so they don't have to worry if they may be doing service jobs where, their boss kind of likes them. And so if they leave, they can fill in someone for a while. And then when they come back, they'll probably have a job working there anyway or whatever. But the people who work regular 9-to-5s, it's a lot harder for them to throw a couple of $1,000s down a person for tickets and haul out to the middle of the desert for a couple of weeks with, with a bunch of stuff to give away. That's just not something that's part of their kind of ability to fit into the traditional middle-class lifestyle of most Americans. Anyway, but if you want to do this at a smaller scale, you might be able to do it at a Maker Faire. I have to say, unfortunately, the Maker Faire we have locally, which is out in Mesa, is weak sauce. It's not that great. I'm glad that they're doing it. I just wish it were more sizable. I think the original one is in Sebastopol, out in California. There's a fairly large one in New York. I don't know if they're doing that every year. I'll link to a video where I did a quick visit to New York, but it's cool. People do all kinds of fun experimental stuff. They have little classes where you can learn how to knit better or make robots or uh, pick locks or whatever you want to do, right? So it is kind of a mini, there's definitely a commercial part because people buy these pieces too, but it is a kind of a mini version, I guess, in some ways, of what you might find at Burning Man. Where are we going with this? Oh, so you have this kind of space, and this Coleman and Golub present these ideals, at least as they come forward in the hacker ethic, as being very closely tied to traditional liberal ideas. This idea of kind of freedom of speech, of expression, ideals that are very much coming out of the Enlightenment tradition. I have to say, let's take 2 points that they have. One is that one example of this is the free software movement, and the other is crypto anarchic or cypherpunk or some of the crypto movements. So let's start with free software. For those of you who don't know, that there's this movement around software should be free. That is not that you should be able to get it necessarily for free, although that usually follows, but that it should be free as in speech. So if you create software, it should be something that you share with everybody and they share alike. And that seems like it's a very, very 1960s, very groovy idea, but it's also pretty central to how most computing works today. Something like 80 or 90% of all of the web is using an Apache server. The Apache server is an open source server. It's free software. It's on an operating system that's usually a Linux-based operating system of one form or another. Also free software. So, in some ways, free. You're using, for a while you were using Firefox, then you were using Chrome, which is not. Then you were using Firefox again, which is for a free and openly available browser. So it hasn't won, strangely. It still coexists with paid software. Adobe now wants you to pay as a subscription. There's still this mix, but the idea behind free software at the beginning seemed like an expression of, and it was explicitly an expression of free speech, that software should be free like speech. This was one of the mottos. And so they take this at its face, and I have to say, I take a little bit of, I love both of these writers, both of these scholars, they're brilliant, but I take a little bit of issue there. I think they're taking it too much at face value. I suspect, and I was only peripherally involved in a lot of these movements, but I suspect that in many ways that argument that free software is like free speech is an argument that was couched specifically so that it would be palatable to Americans who are raised on the idea of anything that had anything in common with communism. So anything that had communal or common space or, and peer production or anything like that sounds really commie. And so I think in a lot of ways, rather than saying, yes, it's a socialist space, yada, 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 they didn't want to embrace that, and they knew that it would be shut down quickly, and it would be scary to people. And so they couched it in this very traditional liberal, very much within that liberal tradition of free speech, that this is something that, is an Enlightenment ideal. It's not that we're, anti-capitalism. No, not at all. We all like to make money, but this is a matter of free speech. And I think that was as much a strategic move as it was really an indication of the ideology of the movement. I think it's a little easier to see the case for crypto movements. I think they're right that if you look at the folks, Bitcoin is a great example of this, right? So Bitcoin is very clearly, in this case, right libertarians who want to kind of wrest currency from the dirty, grubby hands of the government and or the state and the government and create their own currencies. And so that's the most recent iteration. Bitcoin, this idea of cryptocurrencies, is the most recent iteration of these movements. But a lot of these movements, I think, could be tied mostly to right libertarian, but also left libertarian movements that said, we're just trying to make a space separate from us. But that idea of making a space, again, I think you can make an argument that it is a process of forming a public. It is building a wall that says the state can't get in. and in some cases, corporations can't get in. You can't invade this space because we've set up technological barriers that say this is our space and we decide what happens in it. So I think you could also make the argument here that it is still a common space or a public building set of technologies. At the very end of their article, they do touch on this idea of maybe the current hacker ethic is leaning towards global anarchy. Global anarchistic movements, kind of a global anarchistic movement. But I think that there's a strong argument. I think there's a book by Siva Vidyanathan that talks a little bit about this idea of the long history of anarchy as part of this technological process. And I think that's worth at least taking a look at. And I think that you can make a pretty strong argument that these ideas of mutual aid are kind of baked in to the cyberculture from very early on. That we had this move away from it during the 90s, during the dot-com boom, during the sort of colonization of the internet by commercial forces, but that deep undercurrent of what Kropotkin calls mutual aid, this core anarchistic ideal, has existed all along, and that in mutual aid, that tension between individualism, libertarianism, and communalism is kind of baked in. This idea that people should be free to collaborate. I think I mentioned there's this idea of a unconference, which kind of fits into Wikipedia and all these other things. This idea of a conference that is not planned ahead of time. It started with O'Reilly, a publishing company, and they had this something called Bar Camp where you'd show up with tents, felt very much like Burning Man, but now there's lots of unconferences. The Cronkite School at ASU did an unconference around press, kind of press and technology, where people just show up. And there's a bunch of rules. It's very much like this. There's no agenda. There's no, the other pieces aren't there, but there's rules that you have to agree to follow if you show up. And one of those rules is what's called, that's common to almost all unconference type meetings, is this thing called the rule of 2 feet. What that is if you're bored, you can leave. Not necessarily the whole conference, although it applies there too, but people will kind of group off into their own little spaces where they talk about the things that they find interesting. So, early on, there will be this process where people kind of make lists of things they're interested in, and you try to find, this kind of homophily. You try to come together in the groups that you are most interested in. You find someone who's an expert. You say, hey, can you give a little bit of a talk? Or you just have a conversation. You decide to build something together. This is a very common kind of process, right? Very organic. But one of the rules for that is the rule of 2 feet, which is if you're in one of these groups, and often people will like grab a bunch of chairs, sit them in a circle. If you're in that circle and you're bored, you have absolutely the right to stand up and leave. No judgment from the outset. Now, honestly, I would do that anyway because I'm rude. I'm also like if I go to an academic conference, I'm not trying to impress anyone anymore. I don't care. So, it's not like if I were young and looking for a job, I might feel uncomfortable standing up and leaving from a group like that. But here it's very explicit. It's like if you're doing that, you're following like rule number 1. So you should do that. So it's built on this idea that everybody that's in the circle is there because they want to be and they want to contribute to what's going on there. And so ironically, this core idea of independence, of autonomy, of the ability to bodily stand up and leave is essential to collaboration. That once you do that, this is why I hate, just as kind of a tangent, this is why I hate when people take attendance in university courses, undergraduate or graduate. If you don't want to be there, we don't want you there, right? If you want to be at the table, you should only be at the table if you want to be there and if you're getting something out of it and if you're willing to contribute back to it. So, this core autonomy, this core ability to say you have the freedom to control yourself is also at the core of forming these collaborative spaces in publics. I think I'll stop there. As we go in next week, we'll be talking a little bit more about what that means, especially in youth spaces. But how do would it be better if more of our spaces were like Burning Man? Not that we would just pick up and leave town and go out to the middle of the desert, but if in small ways we could make little bubbles of that, would that create a little bit more public space? I will, just as a post note here, I will say, I'm not going to be able to couple with Milo Yiannopoulos. I can't say his name, but hopefully you know who I'm talking about. He's an alt-right kind of figurehead speaker who fell out with the alt-right and now is kind of a pariah there too, after saying that you should be able to have sex with kids or something. So he has a post recently saying that he's bankrupt, and he says the reason for this is he's been deplatformed from Twitter and Facebook, and can only rely on these spaces that those in the right have set up specifically so that those who are alt-right can talk freely. And his complaint is that, he can't get a following that way, that only 20,000 people follow him, and that's not enough to support the lifestyle he's become accustomed to. I joke. This is also part of the conversation around collegiate football too, whether people should be able to have a YouTube account and profit from the ads that you run on it. Followers actually do matter now, and so this plugs into this. I'll link to another video too, that talks a little bit about this. This plugs into this idea that the left is anti-free speech because they've deplatformed these guys, but it also, and this is kind of this core tension in the idea of the liberal ideal of free speech too, which is you have to follow a core set of rules. It's free speech, but there's a cutoff to the free speech. It's like do whatever you want to do as long as it doesn't impinge on others' rights. That's too hard to interpret in practical senses. When within context, that's really hard to interpret. But as a practical matter, yes, people get deplatformed or it doesn't work as a space. So there's a very practical kind of application of this, of kind of rules being followed. And kind of the interesting piece of this is if you think about the salon in people's homes or the coffee house, these were actually public spaces, but they are always supported by some kind of private infrastructure. And that private infrastructure was important not just because it was necessary to provide some of the infrastructure for this to happen, but also because it could enforce some of those rules. It could say, you don't have to go home, but you can't stay here. And so there's an interesting role there for private infrastructure or platforms that are not just kind of incidental, but are a necessary component of these generative rules that allow for public spaces to occur and to continue and to kind of proliferate in some way. All right. Thanks. I'll see you in person next week.